This is the One Soldier Podcast, episode 24, with me, Russell Hillier. On today's show, I'm joined by teacher and professor of religious studies, Gerard McLarney from the University of Alberta. And we're going to do something just a little bit different today because we're not dissecting any historical battles or military memoirs as we so often do, but rather we're going to a place that you might be familiar with if you're an avid reader, and that place is called Middle-earth. That fictional world made popular by J.R.R. Tolkien, perhaps the most influential narrative of the 20th century. We're going to look at what Tolkien is trying to tell us about our own world and our own myths through the ever-present theme and backdrop of war and bloodshed in this epic conflict between good and evil. And even though the battles contained within the volumes of this story didn't actually happen, there are, as with any good fiction, lessons and truths to be learned therein. And so with that, I'm going to take you to my conversation about the myths and warfare of Lord of the Rings with Gerard McLarney right now. All right. Well, I'm just going to say that I knew we were going to have a good discussion when we talked a few days ago on the phone. And I made that comment about how the Riders of Rohan were Vikings on horseback. And then you were like, oh, actually, they were Anglo Saxons. It's more analogous to the Anglo Saxons. So I knew then this was going to be awesome.
Yeah. And a funny thing too is Tolkien was like, no, I'm not. I don't have Anglo Saxons in mind when he's writing the Rise of Rohan. But it's like, and I was like, are you sure? Like, surely that's not the case. But
did he actually go out of his way to say like, no, it's not analogous to any of these historical groups?
Well, at least with the Rise of Rohan, he kind of he was a little more dismissive, like, oh, this is supposed to be Rohan or the Anglo Saxons and so forth.
Yeah.
Well, in general, though, he doesn't want to. Okay, well, it's a bit of a long story, but originally he's writing myth, like he's trying to create a new mythology, is what he's doing now. Originally, though, I don't know if I mentioned this last time, he's trying to write a new myth for England, right? So, because we're talking about King Arthur, maybe, but in any case, yeah. So the English had a dearth of mythology, essentially, right? So, and King Arthur, that it's taken from the French, who, I mean, they would have translated something from the Latin. Maybe they got it from Welsh, because you have the Brits who are in England, who evacuate the island when the Anglo-Saxons start to invade, and that's where you get Brittany, right, in northern France. And so they would have kept some of the tradition alive of Arthur. And so when King Arthur, the story is put together by Sir Thomas Malroy, that's in late 1460s, late 1470. He's taken it from the French, right? And so it's kind of like, is this really British or not? So anything about any culture, well, I mean, not any culture, but there's a lot of famous cultures with mythologies out there, right? Like the Greeks and the Romans kind of borrow a lot of that. Then there's the Norse saga, right? Even as mentioned too, like the Icelandic tradition has their own sagas, which they would read. It's like, what's the British? So okay, so now originally Tolkien has that in his mind, that he's going to write a mythology for England, and so like with like kind of those motifs of like a Return of the King, and how it's all going to set with islands and water and so forth.
So Tolkien, he looked at the myths of England that existed at his time, and he's saying, well, these aren't actually like what, indigenous English myths, or like,
Yeah, like we could do better is basically what he's saying. Like we really don't have much to go on now. Yeah. So, because I mean, think about it. What I mean, even like the Irish have some Celtic heroes and mythology and so forth. So yeah, what do they actually have? All right, so that's originally, like, if you think about it in your own mind, like, what do you know about English mythology other than King Arthur, right?
yeah.
Exactly.
Roundtable.
Okay, so that kind of answers the question, right? So yes, but as he starts this enterprise, this project, he soon abandons it. He realizes that no, this is never going to work, and he ends up then doing something more idiosyncratic. So he just essentially makes his own world. Um, Now, what ends up happening is this becomes a well, I would argue it becomes a modern mythology then. So, in other words, it's not particular to England necessarily, and he actually did abandon that idea. But what he ends up creating, his own idiosyncratic world, is then becomes a mythology that I think modernity or the modern people, contemporary life, started appropriating. You can see some of that too, like in Marvel. Star Wars would be another good example of modern mythology. But our myth for the contemporary life, like George Lucas is expressly attempting to create a modern myth when he's writing Star Wars. And so that's, yeah, Tolkien, he's not necessarily has that particular in mind, but he's going to make something idiosyncratic, and then it becomes really a modern mythology. And if you look at the, well, the proof is in the pudding in some ways. Like The Hobbit, it's over 100 million copies sold, which is if you get over 100 million, that's pretty good. And then
I actually I looked this up.
Oh, did you? Okay,
Yeah, so and by look it up, I mean I went on Wikipedia.
sure,
And
sure.
so
Yeah.
150 million copies of Lord of the Rings sold. By comparison, Harry Potter is at 100 million. So Tolkien still has, now he does have a few decades head start, but
Sure,
still a
yeah.
50 million gap.
Oh yeah, yeah. And what's above him? I mean, I don't know if there's any other fiction that would be above him. I mean, you have some like religious texts, right? Would be higher, like the Bible and so on. But um, yeah. So in terms of yes, narrative or fiction, yeah, so you can see. So there's something in it in Middle Earth that really resonates with modern readers. Yeah,
Yeah. Before we go too far down this road,
sure.
I'm just going to tell the listeners what the genesis of this podcast episode was. And so it all starts at the Calgary Teachers Convention. Usually, well, in normal years, it's a place where, well, it's a time when all the teachers of Calgary sort of meet up, and we do professional development and go to seminars, and there's a lot of drinking that goes on 17th Avenue as well. This
Yeah.
year, obviously different this year. A lot of the sessions typically have titles along the lines of I don't know, like pedagogy, curriculum redesign, blah blah blah.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
then I saw yours, which was Orcs, Elves, and Hobbits, Lord of the Rings, and
Yeah.
that was a fantastic session, by the way. You clearly put a lot of thought into it.
Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I told you I liked it so much. I signed up for the Star Wars one that came after.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But so in this podcast, the listeners already know that we usually talk about or talk to military figures, and we look at historical battles and campaigns and memoirs. So we're going down a different road with this episode, looking at fiction, but I still think it's there's obviously still a lot of lessons that we can learn through fiction, and we're going to get into the wars of Middle Earth. At least I hope we do. But I like where this started off with the myth, and I especially liked how in your session you were mentioning how C.S. Lewis, one of Tolkien's friends, was, and of course that's the author of Narnia. They had some kind of discussion, and C.S. Lewis was saying, "Oh, well, myth isn't really important," and Tolkien's like, "No, it's actually really important." Could you get into that a little bit?
Certainly. Yeah. Yeah. So they have a long history, Lewis and Tolkien. They first met at a Oxford faculty meeting. So you think of, let's go to a staff meeting. How great could this be? And Lewis is writing in his diary later. I mean, kind of paraphrasing a little bit, but he's like, a nice chap. He just needs a slap or two, kind of wake him up a little bit. And so eventually, though, they did form a very solid friendship, and a lot of it revolved around myth. So they would get together on Monday nights. It was part of a group called the Coal Biters, and so they would, read Icelandic myths, and what better way to read them than to read them in the original. So they would actually learn Icelandic and pass around the dictionary, have, a glass of brandy on hand and around the fire. That's the idea of a coal biter. Someone's close enough to the fire, you're almost eating the coals, right?
Yeah.
And this was formative for both of them. Because we wouldn't actually know about Tolkien if it weren't for C.S. Lewis. We were just talking about The Hobbit there, and think of the copies that it sold. Well, his original audience was actually very small. It was his family, and so it's Lewis who's able to ask him a bit about it and draw him out. That he's then able to share this more publicly, and so that's without Lewis, we wouldn't really know about Tolkien, and we could say vice versa because. In those discussions, Lewis also grew up loving Norse saga and so forth, but he didn't. He was, so the line that he uses with Tolkien there, because those discussions go late into the night, and one night having a late night talk, and walking. It was, I think, 3 a.m. or something at this point. A lot of people had already left, but Lewis says to him, "Myths are lies, and therefore worthless, even though breathed through silver." So myths are lies and therefore worthless, even though breathed through silver. And what does it mean breathe through silver? Well, again, they're ornate. There's a certain beauty in them, but for Lewis, at the end of the day, they're non-historical. They're fantasy, so they are lacking. They're fallacious essentially at the end, and therefore worthless.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Tolkien, he would not disagree that they're not historical. But what he says is that no, they are the vehicles for expressing truth. In fact, the best vehicles we have on hand. And why? Because they involve the imagination. They involve they give us a language that is not centered on the empirical, on the physical, because the world in which we live in, Tolkien would say, is filled with the transcendent, and so we need mythology in order to make sense of life. And you think this is a truism that it goes back to the earliest art that humans have produced. You go to the caves that prehistoric caves in France and Spain and so forth. You have artwork, right? That's what you see, right? And there seems to be a narrative in there. There's this, and we can't function without story. You, myself, our kids, without a framework for placing your life in a story, a civilization wouldn't function.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, so Tolkien's going to say, no. Myth is, and then he has his philosophical or religious understanding of mythology, and that ties into his understanding of what the role of the artist or the storyteller is. So he has this, what he calls true myth. So there's the one true myth, and that's the myth written, or the story written by the capital A artist, namely God. So the world in which we live in is actually the penmanship of the artwork of the great artist, God himself, who in the fullness of time enters into his own story. And so that's the true myth. And so in this, the story of Christ, what we find is all other stories are subsumed and authenticated. So by that, what Lewis begins to understand then is how he can make sense of the Christ event, the cross and resurrection and so forth, in light of his life and story, mythology, and so on. So that's instrumental for Lewis becoming a Christian and going from there. So so that's part of Tolkien's take on the role of mythology. So it's a vehicle. It's foundational for us for our placing, situating our own lives in it, and also for expressing what he would call well, it's Augustine who calls it the song of the universe. So the harmony which we see around us. So this is what myth does.
It makes you wonder when you start going down this road of what myth is. It makes you wonder what kind of myths do we have in our own world today, in our own country. Like I was sort of as I was sort of thinking about this podcast, I was thinking, well, what are the myths of Canada? And I don't know. I'm not sure. I think actually, I think we sort of have. I think in Alberta we have a little bit of a distinctive myth. It's the West.
Okay. Yeah. Tell me more. What do you? Okay. Tell me more.
Well, I haven't really developed this thought all that much.
Okay.
But
Sure.
it's the West. It's the the spirit of the cowboy, independence.
Yep. Yes, definitely.
Not so much. Not so much deference to authority as you might find in other parts of the country, especially where I'm from in Ontario. So I think we do have a myth in Alberta maybe we're not even conscious of it, but I think it does sort of inform our society to some degree.
Yep. And I've had a number of friends who've also teachers who've moved to Alberta to teach and then moved on to another province, and they have some really interesting insight on Alberta. And so one is they also mentioned is somewhat transient in that often people will come here for several years. They're going to work hard, and that's part of it. It's work, right? We're going to work. We're going to work hard, and and then sometimes, well, we've come here for a little while, and then we're going to move on again, right? Or our roots aren't necessarily as deep, perhaps, as certainly you'd find in Eastern Canada.
And isn't that the part of the cowboy myth too, of the transient, cowboy who's running from town to town?
Yeah, into the sunset, right? Going
Yeah.
west out into the sunset. Yeah. And so there's perhaps a how would you say that? Family kinship is going to be all the more important in our immediate family, but we wouldn't necessarily have the same sense of a rootedness in terms of lineage with going back again. Like you can go other places further east, and of course people can trace their families back sometimes generations, right? For myself, I go back to 1979. Well, actually a little bit earlier when my parents came over, but my dad, he immigrated here, he was 19, so I was in the late 60s, but so that's as far as I go back. But
And so what? Where did they immigrate from?
Ireland. Yeah, so my dad came over, he was 19. I think he had $300 to his name, and he just got on a plane and landed in Montreal. Didn't stay too long, and then he came out west. He ended up working in Frobisher Bay and a few other places up north, but he kept coming back to Edmonton, which is, I'm just from the Edmonton area. So and then he would travel back and forth. Back then, actually, it wasn't that expensive to fly back home to Ireland. So he would go back and forth, and then he met my mom and convinced her, okay, we're gonna go to Canada. After they got married, just 2 years. Well, they're still here. So and that was back in the 70s. Yeah. So they're still here.
Well, it's true though. I mean, if you being from Ontario, my family's been in Ontario since the early first half of the 1800s, and
Okay.
you definitely get a sense of you use the word rootedness, and I think that's a good word. I mean, the towns there are often 200 years old, and there's nice big stone buildings that have been around for a really long time. And then when you compare that to Calgary, or really any town or city in Alberta, it doesn't stack up that way. It hasn't been through the course of history and time in the way that the older parts have.
Yeah, like what building in Calgary is 200 years old, right? Well, same thing in Edmonton, none, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, cool, man. Hey, I was, as we were talking about this a few days ago, how Tolkien was, well, he was a product of his time. He was a soldier in World War I, and fascinating. Interesting concept is that he lost all of his childhood friends in that war, and so he was forced to. And this goes back to the relationship he had with Lewis. This new, you called it like a new fellowship that he created with Lewis.
that's right. Yeah. No, he had one friend who actually survived, who he was close with before the war. But I mean, just one. So imagine, you have a high school students who belong to a group. So it could be a basketball team, it could be chess club, like whatever fellowship you have, whatever group you have. And then the war happens, and you go off, and there's only two of you that make it back, right? And so that was what it was like. So Lewis, C.S. Lewis, he also went over and in World War One as well. They both actually succumbed to trench fever and then returned after. So Tolkien, he's a little bit late to the game. It's 1916 when he gets into World War One, and he's just newly married in the spring of because he gets the call up. He knows that he's going to go into the front lines, see some, and so he quickly gets married before he goes to his childhood sweetheart. And so that was in March, and then he's at the Battle of Somme, and that's July of 1916. And so he's there for 4 months. I think it goes till November, but he in October he gets trench fever, which I guess it comes from body lace, and so then he convalesces. They send him back to England. He helped in the backfield from England afterwards once he recovered, but he never went back to see action. But I mean, many of your listeners probably know much more about the Battle of the Somme and so forth.
Well, it's typically regarded as World War One was a savage war. Probably, if you had to pick the one war that you wouldn't want to be in as a frontline soldier, that World War One would probably be it, because you're living in a trench for 4 years, just awful conditions. And then not only that, but he's in the worst battle of the worst war. It was the opening day of that campaign was the deadliest day in British Empire history.
Yes, some 55 or 56,000 casualties, right, in one day. Not to mention, there's also on the German side, the Allies. I was just looking at some of the stats. I think in total in that 5-month span, they had over, is it 400,000 casualties for just the British, right?
For just one side.
Just the British, and then they're not including their allies, plus what the Germans suffered. So just a horrendous loss of life. I actually have a quote here from one of Tolkien's letters, if you want me to read it. And here, he's writing, it's a very interesting letter. He's writing it to his son. Two of his sons actually were in Second World War. And he's writing to Christopher Tolkien, who's in World War II at this point, and he's reflecting on his own experience of war from the first. And he says this, just to mention just part of it, and he's talking about his writing. And in fact, during this war, he says is that it generated Morgoth. Now, Morgoth is one of the original henchmen, the original bad guy. Melkor, he also goes by Melkor. So Sauron is the big bad boss in Lord of the Rings, but he would be his boss. So he's the one who teaches Sauron. Okay, so it generated Morgoth, so the evil figure in Middle Earth, as well as the history of the elves. And so he's saying here, and also some early languages. So he would start developing his own languages as he's in the word. So he says this: much of this was done. So discarded or observed. Now, quote: he says, "Were done in grimy canteens, at lectures in cold fogs, in huts full of blasphemy and smut, or by candlelight in bell tents." Even some down in dugouts under shell fire. Okay, so this is how he's writing his raw materials, which later become Middle Earth, the Silmarillion, Lord of the Rings, and so on. So again, this is done by candlelight under cold fog, sometimes in dugouts under shell fire. And he admits too, like it wasn't the most efficient way of writing, and he wasn't always present-minded, and maybe he should have paid more attention to what was going on and so forth in the battle. But that was one way in which he tells his son Christopher, who's now in the Second World War. It's through this narrative. So as I was thinking, this is like war has a it shapes him in a foundational way, but at the same time, what Tolkien is doing is trying to shape his own future as well, writing it as well. And so it's actually it's contemporaneous, like he's writing it at the same time he's in the war. And so both are taking place, the war shaping his writings and his writings shaping his reaction, his understanding, and really his ability to deal with what he's witnessing in the Battle of the Somme.
Well, it's interesting too how he's developing this concept of an evil character, which will then come about in his books. And in World War One, like World War One isn't like World War Two, where there's like an evil side, but World War One is sort of, I mean, the slaughter was meaningless because you can't really look at either side and say, oh, well, that side was evil and this side wasn't. So I guess he's just looking at the evil which is permeating like the battlefield itself.
Yes, and you have a whole revolution in English society, which was very stratified, certainly prior to, and the class distinction would be most important. Which so then begin to ask questions of why are we doing this, right? Who made the call that we should actually go into this war in the first place, and what was the point? And a lot of that comes through, I think, in some ways. The Hobbit, where part of the whole plot revolves around the recovery of lost wealth, and you have the Battle of the Five Armies and so forth. And right before the Battle of the Five Armies, it's the dwarves are just ready to shed blood of the elves and the men who later become their allies, because it's all revolve around, well, in this case, it's the Arkenstone, this coveted prize, and it's only through renunciation that peace is established between the elves and men and the dwarves. So it's a fascinating take on wealth, and its ability to generate strife, and not just on a forensic or an individual level, but at a statewide level, or for a tribe or a kin or a people. So yes, so actually, yes, asking those questions. Why did we have this war? What was it for in the end? And certainly, you can see some of those ideas coming out in The Hobbit, particularly.
For a couple thoughts on that, you are in your job as a teacher and a professor. You do a lot of writing, right?
I try to.
Uh,
A lot of
yeah,
emails.
yeah, okay. So, but I mean, when you're like writing your lessons or
Yeah.
whatever, like, we always, as writers, like, there's always times when we have, this writer's block. But
Yeah.
Tolkien, when you read about him writing what will become the books in the trenches, no excuse for writer's block. If he can get it done in the trenches, then we don't have writers don't have much of an excuse not to get it done.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, and just it's inconceivable that the war didn't have some kind of effect on him as a man and him as a writer.
Yeah, there's a few things that can be said there, and you're absolutely correct. It has a profound, and how could it not, influence on him, his entire generation, and even the one to come, and then you have World War II, right? But yes, just incredible. It's hard to actually articulate how much of an impact it has.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, okay, I'll say a little bit about that. You mentioned him writing. It's interesting though. He doesn't, when he talks about his own writing, he talks about it as not as a creation. So he's not creating this story, this myth. He actually calls it a discovery. Now that's very idiosyncratic. It's as if the story is already out there somewhere and he's just discovering it.
The muse is giving him the story.
Exactly. Like now you hear this from other people. I know you've done some writing as well, right? So perhaps sometimes you feel like you're just, I don't know, the right word is for an athlete perhaps might be flow, or you're in the zone, right? So you just got it and you're just going, just let me pound it out on the keyboard, right? It's just coming. And Da Vinci actually talks about this in his own discoveries and so forth. Like he just felt like he was being led in some ways. Now, for Tolkien as a writer, he's going to say that he's discovering this. He's not creating it. One example would be like the Black Riders. He says, I didn't know where they just showed up, and there they were. So I had to fit them in somehow. And the same thing with like Faramir, like Boromir's brother. Like and at first he's like, I don't know if I really like this guy, like, but he's there anyhow, so I got to deal with it. And he goes with it. So he talks about the discovery. Now, though you talked about the influence of war in his writing, what's we were talking earlier about the popularity of his books and so forth. What would distinguish Tolkien from a lot of the other writers of his generation? Is particularly like leading up to World War I, you had this whole from the late 1800s, even the mid to late 1800s, you have this whole impetus of really a sense of things are getting better and better. Progress is the word, really. You have technological progress, longevity with science and medicine, technology, and so forth. You also have social Darwinism in the background. So there's understanding that things are getting better and better, and soon we're going to solve all of the world's problems. And that was really a common sentiment prior to the First World War. World War I shatters that in many ways, because we can look now at technological progress and see the havoc, the absolute chemical warfare, and so on. I mean, machine guns were around earlier, but looking at this, you can see like what this can actually do. And so a lot of writers become cynical and pessimistic about humanity and where we're going with all this, and to extent a disillusionment with tradition. Tolkien, on the other hand, he is no less disillusioned about the propensity of humanity to fall into evil and sin. So he has that down, certainly, but he actually looks he doesn't become pessimistic and cynical in the same sense, but rather he goes to the past. He looks at he's a medievalist as well, so he looks to tradition to guide his way forward. And we were talking earlier there. In some ways, what's going to guide his way forward is myth, and it's actually then it becomes his own myth. In that this is the contemporary myth, which he's going to now create. And some things about war in his writings is that it's integral to Middle Earth. In fact, war is life. You want to think of it that way.
Yeah.
And I think that's a motif that Tolkien would certainly agree to. That yes, sorry, other way around. Life is war, right? It's a constant struggle. And this is a very telling exchange at the opening of Lord of the Rings. The hobbits, the four of them, are fleeing the Shire, and they come across Gildor, who's an elf, who's going a different direction. And it basically ended their running right now from the Black Riders. But they want some advice from him. But Gildor says to them, you can fence yourselves in. He says, the wide world is about you. You can fence yourselves in, but you cannot forever fence it out. So in other words, you can hunker down and shelter, but the wide world is about you, and you need to deal with it. So it's not an escape. You can't escape from the world's problems. You have to deal with them. There's only really one character that I can think about who is somewhat of a pacifist in his writings, and he's a very unique character, and that's Tom Bombadil, who, if you're familiar with Lord of the Rings, your readers are, he's an odd duck, to say the least. Now, a very fascinating character himself, but unlike pretty much any other character, and he's the one who really doesn't want to be involved in the War of the Ring. Other than him, yes, there is a part that everyone has to deal with it in some way or another. So yeah, you see that going on. Now, speaking of that, how do Tolkien views war, and how we see war in his own writings? You see something of a just war theory articulated by Faramir. So Tolkien is not necessarily going to, on the one hand, glorify bloodshed and gore. He's certainly going to acknowledge it. But I think Faramir, I'll quote here from him if I can pull it up. It kind of expresses this. What does he say here now? Yes. So this is Faramir speaking here to Frodo, and he says, "War must be, while we defend ourselves against a destroyer who would devour all." So he says, "War must be." And again, if we have an opponent, yes, we gotta deal with this. But he continues on. He says, "But I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend, the city of the men of Numenor." And Numenor, that's Minas Tirith, his people. And so that's how Faramir expresses his, and he's a valiant warrior himself, honored and all the rest, and courageous. And that's how he expresses his articulation of how he views the war, and it's
So for
part
him,
of life.
war is not a means to itself. It's a way to protect what you love.
Yes, for Faramir, it is, and it's exactly that's exactly it. For Faramir, it's to protect what you love. So he's doing this for that, and he says it's going to happen. So it's inevitable. As long as we have a destroyer who would devour us, of course we're going to be preparing for war. And at that particular moment, the war is about to break loose, essentially.
I guess what you're saying is the other characters are, well, they like war. They enjoy it.
Well, that's an interesting one. Here you do see a different group of people. So this is the men of the Mark. So the Riders of Rohan, and they're again, they're different, I guess, than the Minas Tirith group, Gondor. But I mean, perhaps I don't know if I want to generalize here that the people of Gondor are against the Rohirrim. Maybe it's just Faramir, but so, I mean, Faramir would be different than his brother as well in some respects. But in any case, when it comes to the Riders of Rohan, they have this called a hymn, a song, uh, they call to mind in battle. And here I have it here. It's a great bit of well, it really captures in some ways how the Riders of Rohan view war and what they're doing. And this is their rallying cry, if you like. It goes like this: out of doubt, out of dark, to the day's rising, I come singing in the sun, sword unsheathing. To hope's end I rode, and to heart's breaking, now for wrath, now for ruin, and a red nightfall. So that is called to mind, that hymn. That's kind of like their banner as they go into battle. When they're about to face, it looks like, insurmountable odds. So here they're still going to go into the battle. They're still going to fight to the last man. So that's a out of doubt, out of dark, to the day's rising. I come singing in the sun, with sword unsheathing. So we're going to go for this. And if we go down, this is how we go down, hearts breaking and so forth. But now it's for wrath. Now it's for ruin, right? And a red nightfall. So blood is going to be spilt during this day. And that's the charge. And then King Theoden is the one who leads this, and he really is a character who is really revitalized and rehabilitated when he realizes the warfare that is at his door. For the longest time, he's under the sway of Wormtongue, who's soothing him with all sorts of platitudes and obscuring reality that there's nothing. No, send your troops away to the the far edges of the mark. Don't get them together and prepare for war at all, right? And it's the movie does a great job of this. It's the one place I will admit where the movie can enhances the book a little bit. When Gandalf casts Wormtongue down, and it really looks like an exorcism in the film. In the book, when you read it, you can catch it a little bit more. If you've seen the film, it makes more sense than when you read the book again. But he has to break that spell, that Wormtongue. What a beautiful name, right? Wormtongue. That is he's planted within him, and only then does Theoden rise in stature to his in his fullness of who he actually is, and only then does he really become the king. And that's what a king does he not? Organizes his people, calls them to arms, and it leads the charge. And so this is yes, so war then becomes, at least right, the realization of the war and the call to go out and fulfill your calling here, and that of your people, is what coalesces Rohan, and ultimately becomes one of the deciding factors in the helping lift the siege of Gondor.
A couple things. The First of all, like, I love how it's been many years since I've read the books, but
Yeah.
some things that still, after at least 15 or 20 years, I can remember is Tolkien's use of color and imagery, like especially red. And when you read that quote about King Theoden saying the red nightfall, that triggered my memory of that. And there's other moments where he's talking about like the red sun glinting on the spears, the red fires that are lit up on the mountains. Just sort of I don't know, just it's funny how that just triggered in my mind after all these years. Second of all, really interesting how you bring up that Theoden is he's a new man. War makes him a new man, doesn't it? Wormtongue he's like dope. He's the drug.
Yes.
He's the opium.
He's THC, like concentrate. That's Wormtongue.
But in Tolkien's book, war is the antidote to that.
Well, it's the realization that life is war. We're up against evil day in and day out. Whether we're actually in an overt military context, a combat situation or not, we are in a combat situation every day of our life. Is essentially it. And so this is the spell that Wormtongue is cast upon him. No, send your troops far away. Like, there's nothing to worry about here, right? There's all sorts of analogies we could probably draw today in our own the lives are, you know,
Oh,
not to pick on our
for sure
not
there
to
is.
pick on our students, but the lives of our students, it might seem a little more obvious than our own lives in some cases. Like I still remember, well, it's been a while since we've been in a physical building, but walking in school, and you know, you come in early in the morning, and I still remember the contrast between when I was a student teacher, so this is back in the early 2000s, to today when you come walk into the school. So the early 2000s, you walk into school, you know, there's a few kids congregating, talking to each other, and then as you know, the time passes on, they it's louder and louder in the hallways to the bell rings, and okay, quiet, get into class. Well, nowadays you walk into the school, and okay, there might be a few there early, but then as there's more and more, it's still pretty quiet, and they're not really talking to each other. There might be a few, but they're all like this, right? They're all like this,
Yeah.
and it's shocking at lunch hour when you have six kids around a table, and three of them have a phone in their hands, and the other two have, you know, one on the table, and there's only one person, you know, two people talking, right? Or one or two. So it's anyhow. So that's just
I knew exactly where you were going with this.
you could
Turn
read
on
it.
business, 'cause I see it every day too. It's a fascinating thing how, uh, you know, when you walk in the hallways and it's quiet, but really the kids are just mimicking what the adults are doing. I mean, I tell my own kids this, that when I was young, and we're sort of going off on a tangent here, but when I was
Sure.
young, you know, you'd go to like, let's say the bank with your parents, and people would be in line, and like people would be talking to each other in the line, perfect strangers.
Yeah.
Uh, you don't see that anymore. So, uh,
Yeah, or riding the bus home, right? Okay, I mean, you actually gonna talk to someone on the bus? Like what?
no, only crazy people do that.
Yeah, exactly. Um, but that bit about warfare, we could say that not only that, but evil is formidable. That's something that's front and center in Tolkien's writings, whether it's Smaug, the dragon, or whether it's Sauron, or Melkor and the Silmarillion. Evil is formidable, and so that's the bit about Wormtongue is to forget about that, forget about that struggle, right? Be you know, just sit back and relax or whatever. Don't worry about it. So that's kind of something that's going on there, I think, as well.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe you know, I do want to get into the actual uh battle of like outside Minas Tirith and you know some of that stuff. But could you get into the role, or what is Tolkien symbolizing with Frodo being stabbed by the Morgul's sword? I
Okay.
think this is
Sure.
really this is
Yeah.
key.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'll talk about Frodo here. When you're asking about the symbolize and so forth, like there's one of the things you should mention about war, though, when it comes to Tolkien is when he's writing though his stuff, he expressly says he's not trying to write an allegory. So a lot of people first when they're reading this, it's, you know, post World War II, they think that the ring is perhaps an allegory for the atomic bomb, and Tolkien has to kind of dispel this a little bit. Yeah, this is not actually what I'm doing, and in fact he says no, my writing is not an allegory. So he will say, for instance, like the dead marshes, uh, that they have to traverse, where you have it's from an ancient war, from a different age, but you still have the bodies in the field, really they're under a swamp, but they're kind of preserved there, but both orcs and elves, and some people say, well, is he actually talking? You know, this is the trenches, right? This
Yeah,
is what he means
yeah,
from Battle of Somme and so forth. And Tolkien says, well, you know what? Yeah, it is influenced by this, but not only this. I'm not actually trying to recreate what I saw, but these are some of the. There might be some ingredients that came from what I saw here. But he says there's other places of literature I've got. I've brought into the dead marshes and so on. So that's kind of in the background. He's not writing an allegory where you can have a one-to-one correspondence where the ring symbolizes this, you know, like the atomic bomb or so forth,
yeah.
or this
But
weapon.
but he's still drawing from his own experiences
And
to create the setting. And yeah,
yes, yeah, of course, yeah, and he's how he says the term he uses instead of allegory is application. So you can apply what you find in Middle Earth to life, but I'm not trying to rewrite the primary world. He would call it the primary world.
yeah.
So I'm not trying to
So, but
rewrite.
yeah, because so is there really a difference between allegory and drawing from your experiences with things that actually happened?
Yeah, for Tolkien, yes, there's a big difference. So for him with allegory, you can have a one-to-one correspondence. And the reason why he doesn't like allegory, which is part of the reason why him and C.S. Lewis had a bit of falling out later on in life, is that he doesn't like to see this, because allegory is dressing up an old story in new clothes. It's like, why would I rewrite a story that already happened? Rather, he wants to give credence, he wants to give respect, we might say it that way, to the characters that he's writing. They can't be bound by some other event or story that's already happened, but rather they need to be themselves. They're their own, and that's why this whole idea of discovering them instead of creating them. So he's not going to try and pigeonhole them or shimmy them into this particular angle because this is what happened in a different story, but rather he's going to let them flourish. It's almost like giving freedom to his creation. All right. Now, you asked though about the Morgul blade and Frodo. Yeah, that's a profound bit of the story that's often overlooked, particularly if we're more familiar with the movies because I mean they're so long that I mean Peter Jackson, God bless him, this is a great series that he produced. How many hours can he fit into like Return of the King? I mean, you can have extended edition; it's even longer. But so
Right.
there's a whole bit of the scouring the Shire, which is really more or less left out,
Yeah.
and this is the aftermath, which is because you think, okay, they drop. Not spoiler alert. What happens with the ring? Okay, they destroy the ring. Okay, I don't want to give that. Okay, so do you think, okay, it's over now? Okay, the mission, fate accompli, right? But no, what we find here is eventually they return to the Shire, and guess what? Who's in the Shire? Well, it's Saruman. He's escaped from the he's under police
I,
of Treebeard and the Ants, right, at Isengard, and so they call him Sharky now at this point. But he's kind of masterminding the destruction of the Shire to the best of his ability, and you see this kind of whole industrialization thing going on, and all the smog and pollution, all the rest, and now they have. Yeah, like a sheriffs they call them instead of sheriffs, like it's a police state almost is what he's trying to establish. Okay, so that's happening, and they have to go back there. Frodo is very reluctant at this point to draw a weapon, and he does realize, oh no, we if a push comes to shove, yes, we're gonna have to do this. But he there's a certain, how would we say this? He's a wounded fellow. Well, I do have to give it away a little bit. When it comes to Mount Doom, okay, he says he falls. Okay, he is not the hero of the story. This is actually maybe we'll just associate Frodo. He must be the hero, right? Well, it's actually not him. When he comes to Mount Doom, he says, I've come here, but what I've come to do, I choose now not to do." And he says, "So what I've come to do, I choose now not to do." And he says, "The ring is mine." And so this is Frodo's fall. He succumbs to the power of the ring. And it's really Sam is the one who carries him. Sam is the true hero of the story, and he's the one who carries him up there, and the one who helps guide him home again as they're going. But in any case, Frodo. There's a fall which he experiences it's really it's the impact of being that this closeness to the corruption of the ring, this corrosive force of evil which the ring is. And also, yes, you mentioned the Morgul blade, which he is pierced with, which is designed to really draw someone to allegiance to essentially the same thing, to the ring. And so this he's saved from that at that battle. He recovers a Weathertop through the help of Aragorn and then Elrond. But that woundedness that he experiences Weathertop, as well as the fall at Mount Doom, is that it stays with him. So he has a hard time dealing with it, and so later on. This is 2 years later after Weathertop, where he's first pierced with the blade. It's coming up to the anniversary, and he's just all out of sorts. Sam can tell, what's up, Frodo, and he's just gloomy, and he's weakened, and it's the wound. It's still with him. And he says it's something I will bear as long as I'm in Middle Earth. And so for the rest of his stay on Middle Earth, he's a wounded fellow, and he has to try to deal with this. Now, what's interesting about Sam also carries the ring. He sees much of the same battle. Now, okay, granted, he wasn't pierced with a Morgul blade, but at the same time, I mean, he's doing battle with Shelob, and he's seen his fair share, we could say.
Yeah.
Um, now, Sam has to deal with some of the same things. Interesting. He ends up getting married, and is starting a family. And his child he wants to name Frodo. So the new Frodo, but it turns out it's a girl. So she's Eleanor instead. But we can see how Sam is going forward after the war, and rebuilding. He's a gardener, and then now he becomes a family man, and he has a certain purpose which guides him. Frodo, the bachelor. And again, that woundedness, it's never healed. He doesn't get over it, but he has to deal with it to a certain extent. I mean, he does his best through fellowship and friends, and yeah, so it stays with him.
Yeah, and it's interesting because well, I think this shows like a level of I don't know, prescience from Tolkien, because he's seeing and writing about something that wasn't really spoken of at the time. You know, people when they were in combat for a long period of time, when they cracked, as everyone will crack eventually. You know, if you see enough combat, they call it shell shock or soldier's heart or whatever, you know, euphemism it is. But Tolkien seems to be, I don't know, he seems to be like really he's just like seeing it clearly in a time when it wasn't really spoken of all that much, which is really interesting.
Yeah, and part of it is having a foundation of what is good and what is evil. So understanding the immensity of evil and understanding its power. So if that you can have that down, that then becomes a groundwork for understanding how can I move forward then from experiencing this massive, really encounter with evil, right? How can I move forward? And so that's part of I think in his writings as a part of it, what's going on there. And as noted, like that's is one of the things that keeps him going through the trenches as well, and writing some of these things out. Um, yes, so that is prescient, certainly. And again, yeah, as by the time we get to World War II, there's the deeper understanding of, okay, yeah, you got to rotate troops out after 2 weeks and so forth when you're in the trenches. Like you can't just leave them there indefinitely because no one can handle that. It doesn't matter how well formed you are and what kind of base you have. It's just there's only so much a person can take.
That's right. And what's I've had veterans who have been in modern warfare tell me that you know, our understanding of PTSD is a little flawed because it's been put to me different ways, but essentially, like I think a lot of us who have never been in war or combat, we think like, okay, you either have it or you don't. You're either going to be like an animal on the battlefield or you're not going to be able to take it. But what's been told to me is that it's not like that. You never actually know how you're going to react in battle. It's new every single time. So just because you are, you know, a complete animal or a beast in one battle, the next day you could be you know, sheltering in your foxhole.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, definitely. You see this a little bit in a more ancient epic, and that's the Iliad. So Homer is right. It's just one scene where it's King Agamemnon who has to go out there, and you know it's the Achaeans, like the Greeks against the Trojans, right? And his side, Agamemnon's side, that's the Achaeans or the Greeks. They're, I mean, he's the king, but it's not like a rigid structure where you follow the orders of the king. It's more like a tribal confederacy where, yeah, I might listen, but we're from a different tribe, so I'm your ally, but I might go into battle, I might not. Anyhow, he has to go around and to the troops, who some of them are sitting on the sidelines. They're in the chariots, and like is like, hey, come on, like, get in the battle. What are you doing? Why are you on the sidelines? And then he has to kind of antagonize them a little bit. Diogenes is the one guy who's just sitting back, like, and it's someone's like, are you going to take this from him? Like, come on, you're a great fighter. You don't have to prove yourself today. Why are we even going to get in this battle? We've already fought, in the
Yeah.
other battles. So yeah, you can see that the psychology of it in different works of literature and so on. And it's not the same every day. And how do you enter into that zone, and how do you get to that next level, when it comes to athletes might use a different term, like I mentioned earlier, like flow or something like this,
Yeah.
but or getting into that zone, like how do you actually get combat ready, that? So yeah, it's I don't know if it's a tangible thing that you can put your hand on, or not, but
Yeah. No,
th- th-
it's a good point. Yeah, for sure.
And I was going to mention one other thing, though, about recovery, and that is something which we see in, just mentioning there, the scouring of the Shire, because the war is over now, right? After Frodo has won, and the allies, or the alliance, rather, this last alliance that they've won. So shouldn't it just be bed of roses now? Shouldn't it just be glory and well, from one glory to the next, right? And it's not. It's a tough slug going back, and scouring. It means to, like, it's a cleaning, a cleansing, because the place that they've gone back to is now unrecognizable, and things are turned upside down in many ways. And mentioning there, it's really become almost like a police kind of state, like, and this I mean, there's the shark used behind all this, but so some people wonder, okay, is this Tolkien and his take on coming back to contemporary society after the war? Like, it's like we went out there and now we come back, but it's not all that easy when we've come back after what we've all been through. So you can see some of that. Yes, there's the acknowledgement that no, as long as you're here on Earth, there's going to be struggle.
Yeah.
And yeah, so we can see that coming through, as well. There are, how we use this, the right word is not perhaps solutions, but there are ways of going, working through the mire, we might say that. So and some of the things which we see in Tolkien's writings. So I mean, of course, we're going to acknowledge that there is the formidable evil which we face all the time. So how do we deal with it then, right? And for what we see in his writings is there are a few key things, and one is friendship. It's friends, and I'm sure your listeners know this very well. But when it comes to, from what I understand, when it comes to combat and so forth, a regiment where people are friends with one another. It's not so much you have an allegiance to an idea or some ideal out there. I mean, you do have to have some framework for that, but to have a friendship, right, a fellowship with that's going to create a bond which will get you through both on a battlefield, right, and by extension afterwards, life after, right. So that would be one key which Tolkien certainly we see in his writings. It's friendship, that fellowship, which in his own life, you mentioned earlier, right, banding together with other veterans, and like C.S. Lewis, also, and others. They didn't know each other before, but they had been through some of the same things. And again, many of these men had lost many, if not all, of their childhood friends, and so now they need to reform new
Yeah.
friends, right? And so they have that commonality, but that's key, I think, for them.
Yeah.
And also then they become creative too, right, with what they do and their output.
Yeah, and that's like you're just like describing the genesis of the Legion. I mean, that's the whole point of it, is for veterans who don't even know each other, who can come together and have like a mutual understanding of, what they've been through, and seek comfort that way. So knowing that war is such an integral part of Middle Earth, the land that Tolkien's created, I'm hoping we can like geek out a little
Sure.
bit at least.
Yeah.
So the Riders of Rohan,
Yeah.
knowing that Tolkien says no, there's no analogies, but yeah, okay. So the Riders of Rohan, they're the Anglo Saxons.
Yeah.
What does that make the orcs?
Ooh, that's a good question. That's a really good question. Now, Tolkien will actually give different answers to who are the orcs. And in fact, in his writings, we see slightly different answers, two, in fact. So one is that I think this is from Treebeard, who basically saying, yeah, they're like a corruption of elves. So they have been somehow succumbed to Sauron or Melkor, and here they ultimately become corrupted. And so this is the idea that evil doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's really just a corruption of what was once good. There's another hints and so forth in Tolkien's writings that perhaps the orcs are just really the genesis of the Melkor or Sauron himself, essentially. So there's a little bit of question about, okay, where do they originate from then? And I think the corruption of good is a motif which we see resonating throughout much of his writings. Like think of not just the orcs, but the ring wraiths, right? The Black Riders. Well, what are they, right? What's behind those masks, right? Oh, behind that hood, what's there? And really, they're formidable foes, but they're cannibalized essentially by the ring, which elongates their life. These are kings from another age, yet they still ride upon earth. But they're all they're raison d'etre is essentially the ring, the ring wraiths, and so they're eaten away till there's essentially they're a shell, but they still have this purpose, which is really just subservient to the ring, which goes with them. So yes, so who are the orcs? Those are kind of two different answers that we find in Tolkien. What's interesting though is he will apply this to contemporary life. So when he's writing like letters to his son in the battlefield and so forth, and he's talking to just in general, like he's talking about other orcs that he sees around him. So there could be orcs, in your neighborhood, right? There could be orcs in your workplace. They could be orcs, yes, on in the battlefield as well. So that's something that he applies more liberally, we might say, the idea of an orc to how we might behave and act in our own life, and how we see that behavior exhibited as well.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, kind of idiosyncratic again. Tolkien being he made up that word orc, so that I mean, some of the words were around before, like a goblin and dragon, of course, wizard, but orc is it's his. So
well, it's a fitting word. If you didn't know anything about Middle Earth, if you heard the word orc, you'd sort of like already get an image in your mind, which I think just goes back to the mastery of the many languages that Tolkien could draw from.
Yeah, and yes, for sure.
The pivotal battle of Middle Earth is, I think it's called the Battle of Pelennor Fields. I think I have that right.
Yeah.
And so the Riders of Rohan coming down, saving Minas Tirith at the last second, really. They're heeding the call of their alliance with Gondor, this ancient alliance, which I want to get to, by the way. But it's very reminiscent of, I don't know if you're familiar with the Siege of Vienna in the 1600s with the Ottomans.
Okay. Yeah. I don't know all the details, but yeah.
Well, I'm not going to pretend I know all the details either, but
Okay, sure.
you have basically Vienna is under siege for many months by the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire's army is huge. The defenders are few. They send out the call to the Christendom to help, and many of the calls go unanswered. And the Ottomans are getting closer and closer. The sappers are at work. They've blown holes in the defensive walls. It seems like Vienna falls, and of course, if Vienna falls, then Central Europe is in big trouble. And then at the very last moment, this mighty host of Polish and various German units arrive. Biggest cavalry charge in history, by the way, at the siege of Vienna. And so they ride down and they smash through the Ottoman forces. I don't know. You can't help but draw the comparison between the two, at least in my mind.
Oh, no, I think that would be a very valid comparison to make, because you see the way Minas Tirith is situated, and Gondor itself. Again, originally Tolkien is trying to write a mythology for England, and so some of the geography is tied into that. And later, again, he's not so tied to it, and it kind of lets it become its own thing. But yes, you can see Minas Tirith in some ways being reminiscent almost of Constantinople, which is the eastern bulwark, which really prevents Islam from taking over Europe. I mean, a lot of perhaps if you're more from the West, you might think of the Battle of Tours or something like this in
Yeah,
722,
exactly.
right? Like the Charles Martel, right? This is us, pushing back the Islamic invasion of Europe. Well, I mean, that was kind of probably a skirmish on the outskirts, and wasn't maybe that decisive in stemming the tide. Like it was like the extent as was Spain. Okay, but it was Constantinople. So Constantinople is what endures till 1453. And without this, we probably wouldn't be speaking English today, right? And
Right.
Christianity wouldn't be like a major religion in Canada either. So yes, yes, Minas Tirith very much seems, in that sense, that bulwark on the east, which is just staving off. A capitulation, or really as being subsumed by a whole other group, and really the end of our culture, essentially. So yeah, you can definitely see that going on as well. And what's interesting is the hobbits in the Shire, and maybe the Riders of Rohan might be more aware of it, but they're not always aware that like who's actually protecting us, right? Like
Yeah.
maybe you're living in Ireland or something, and you're just not aware of like, well, why is our culture still standing, right? Like who's actually policing out there, right? Like who's keeping things in line? So yes, that's
It's on the frontier.
Constantinople. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and they had that role for centuries. I mean, it's 410 when the West falls of the Roman Empire, but it stands for another 1,000 years in the East. So
Yeah. What's interesting to me is that for good to triumph in
yeah,
Tolkien's world, every single thing has to go the right way. Like every single little thing has to go the right way because the odds are so stacked against them. So what are the main victory conditions for, I don't know what they're called, the Men of the West?
yeah. Well, the last alliance, I guess, is everyone together. So the well, the Numenor would be like Gondor and so forth. But yeah, the Men of the West, you have the Elves, and everyone is involved, right? I guess you have
Yeah.
Gandalf is in there too, but so the dwarves, right? There's some dwarves, but it's something you'd never expect. Okay, so you mentioned that, right? So you have the Men of the West. Okay, we can throw in a few elves that show up, and I mean, there's not that many dwarves, but right. So who's actually, and you have Gandalf, of course, right? So I can ask you, like, who's the most instrumental in the victory?
It's a tough one. And that's sort of what I'm getting at, is that like
Okay,
everybody is.
okay, how about the Hobbit then? So in the Hobbit, who's most instrumental in the things going the right way? Which character, if you're going to point to a character? Uh,
Would it be Gandalf?
yeah, I mean, you could certainly, yeah, of course, you can argue Gandalf, but in some ways it's Bilbo, right? I mean, he's the one who hands over the Arkenstone to Gandalf and the elves and the men who are besieging Thorin and the dwarves. And without him doing that, and he's also the one who dispossesses Smaug of his prized cup, which ends to Smaug's demise and so forth. And so it's this tiny hobbit who's instrumental in this the victory of the Battle of Five Armies. Now Bilbo's not really doing much in the Battle of Five Armies because he's just this tiny little hobbit, but he's instrumental in that. Now you think of Lord of the Rings, well, it's Frodo of the Shire, and of course Samwise Gamgee as well, not to mention Merry and Pippin. What an odd choice. Like what an odd, most unlikely hero possible. And so you're asking, what are the conditions for victory? One we could say is be like a hobbit. All right, so if you could go around barefoot, I suppose. What else does it mean to be a hobbit, right? But here we might think of the Latin term would be humilis, which in English would say humble, humbleness, and humilis means to be of the earth. So true humility means to be of the earth in the sense of like have pity on me or something like that. Self-pity, that's not what it means. It means just to acknowledge your status, to acknowledge who you are in life. And so humility is key for this battle which we find ourselves in day out. That's one. Another one, I think we already mentioned this, is friendship. So if I recall that scene where they're going to Moria, the mines of Moria. It is one of my favorite passages in Tolkien's writings when they're in Moria. And so this is the 9 walkers who've traveled, and they're trying to get around the mountains and they can't, so they got to work back. And Gandalf is really wants to go into the mines of Moria, and Aragorn's all apprehensive about it. Anyhow, they're trying to get in, and the door's locked, and they're like, how are we going to get in? And they're just spending all this time. There's the uh, the image of the door there that appears, and they can see the door, and then there's a password, like, oh, just say the password and speak the password and you can get in, right? And they're trying to figure out what it is, and it eventually figured out it's Melon in that Elvish, but it just means speak friend, and the door's open. So all they have to do is speak the word friend. And poor Gandalf, I mean, he's knocking his head on the wall trying to figure this out. But I mean, out of all things, you at least expect this is the key which unlocks the door, friend, right? And so again, that is something which is crucial to any victory which we're going to have or experience, right? So humility, friendship. Another one we could say is sacrifice. I mean, think of the fellowship, right? So they all have other things they could be doing at that time, right? Aragorn wants to reclaim the throne of Aenor and Gondor, but Boromir certainly wants to revitalize Minas Tirith and its alliance. They've all made major sacrifices to get where they need to be. But I'm sorry. But yes, they rather, and there's other things that are calling their attention, but they go and do this anyhow. Frodo, for his part, this is almost like a death sentence when he goes, but he freely says, oh, "I'll take the ring," and they're like, "Oh, I'm glad you said that, Frodo, because we don't know who else is going to get this." So yeah, sacrifice, and Sam, his just devotion to Frodo is instrumental. So its victory here comes from some of the least looked for, most unlikely quarters, some hobbits, right? And other things we might just take for granted, friendship, right? And other things with, I mean, sacrifice we mentioned, but and with that is responsibility. I mean, today we're just so familiar with what are my rights, like these are rights, these are my rights, right? Um, do we talk much about responsibility? Our duty? This is your responsibility, right? This is your duty. Really? I don't even know what my responsibilities are. Okay, so what are they? Please someone talk. Yes, responsibility would be another one, which we see is key to situating ourselves and being ready to navigate this world. There's
and that's in well, I mean, when you talk about friendship, it's the friendship between individuals with Sam and Frodo. It's also the friendship between nations, Rohan and Gondor. That alliance, I mean, they could not have won the war without, uh, you know, heeding the call of that
Yeah,
alliance.
and it was touch and go for a while because it wasn't clear that this alliance was still happening. Like, okay, we said we were allies like a long time ago, but are we? Is this still right? Are we still on the same page? But definitely, yes.
Yeah, like when the chips are down, are we going to be there? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I guess you could say the alliance of the Western world would be a fair comparison. It's a lot of countries with their own self-interests, and not always getting along that well. But when things really matter, are they going to come together?
Are they exactly? And what we see then happening once the dust settles is some of the men of Minas Tirith might be wondering, well, where was everyone else when we were battling? Well, it's the elves were preoccupied fighting their own battles and so forth. The dwarves had their own things going on, but yeah, you do have some of the elves who do end up coming to the lines, right, and showing up in battle, and so there's somewhat of a renewal of this old ancient alliance which emerges as well. But yeah, you're right. That's the question. When the chips are down, who's going to be there?
Yeah,
and yeah,
and I think that's really relevant for the world we live in today as well.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, again, it's part of that worm tongue thing. Is do we even know um, who we're up against, right? I mean, you can have the director of CSIS just remind the population once again, like there's active attempts to infiltrate, industry, and not for. Benign purposes, right? So you have state-sponsored espionage and so on. Again, I mean, in our day-to-day lives, do we acknowledge this? Do we know this is going on? How attentive are we to the world that's out there? I mean, sometimes we're back in 1989 or something, where we think, okay, Cold War's over, we've won, and there's nothing else to worry about now, kind of thing, right?
Or are we the hobbits in the Shire who just have no idea about what's going on in the world?
Well, and that's another very good question. I mean, I mean, that was one of the things back in the previous U.S. election was, certainly the Trump administration was calling for NATO's partners to pay more into their GDP, right, as a percentage of GDP into the military spending and so forth. So yeah, that's a good question. Is what are we able to? What are we putting down? One thing I always bring up with my students is, hey, you know what? When you graduate, there's all sorts of things that you could end up doing. In a lot of countries, the choice is already made for you. You're going to do 1 year of military service, sometimes up to 3 years of some sort of service for the state, and that's not an option. That's something you have to do. And so is there something they're like, really? Whoa, no way! Like where? I'm like, lots of countries, right? It's in fact it's very common that you need to be involved. And so yes, I think certainly amongst my experience, with students and young people, there's not much, I suppose even adults, my friends too, yeah, there's not always that awareness of what's going around us, and
Yeah.
who are our friends, right?
One of the themes of this podcast is how things fall apart really quickly. So in other words, history moves imperceptibly slow for 99% of the time. And then you get to that last 1%, and then history moves really quickly, and all of a sudden you're off the edge of the cliff.
Yeah.
It happens really quickly. I mean, who in okay, here's a good example. Sarajevo, Winter Olympic City, the Olympic City of Sarajevo, 1984. Less than 10 years later, it's the epicenter of the worst genocide in European history outside of World War II. Rwanda, 1993. Who could have predicted that 1 million people would be macheted to death a year later? We can look to our own country. In February 2020, so about a year ago, who could have predicted that the world would be so different like it is today? And so I think Tolkien was onto something about how Middle Earth had at least the Shire had a pretty good run, a pretty peaceful run, and then all of a sudden things happen quickly.
Things happen quickly, and yes, so that we mentioned already that the wide world is about you. You can fence yourselves in, but you can't fence it out forever. So there's that as well. But then there's also, once things do happen. Okay, so once things are set in motion, and now we realize, okay, this is where we're going now. The question is, you might not have chosen to be there in that space and time, but that's where you are, right? So that's where you find yourselves. How are you going to react, right? What are you going to do with the cards that are dealt to you now? Okay,
Yeah.
and this is the call, right? This is where virtue is where the rubber hits the road, right? This is where, yeah, your virtue needs to come into play, and really it's where your mettle is tested. And so that's at the individual level, and I think the same thing could be said at a community level, and then obviously more broadly at a state level. Yeah, that's where. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. You never know what's
And the question is, will most people rise to that occasion, or like Frodo and Sam, or are we just a bunch of Boromirs who are going to, go down the wrong path?
Yeah, exactly. And they're
I don't know if we have an answer to that, but I think my gut tells me that we're most of us are Boromir. If we're gonna be honest with ourselves.
yeah, my my inclination to say I can't really just generalize all Canadians and so forth, but I think generally, at least well, maybe Albertans, but it seems to be more of the Shire in some ways. Is that maybe we're not always aware of what's going around the world around us. I mean, certainly we're more aware of like economics, what's going on, and how this needs to be important for our economy and so forth. But yeah, as far as actual combat and what might happen, I don't know if that's actually in our ethos, really.
No, I don't think so, because like if you think of it, if we just go back to the book again, if Canada being the Shire makes a lot of sense, because we're insulated from the dangers of the world. I mean, the world is a dangerous place. There's no denying that. You just look at what's going on in a dozen different countries right now.
Yep.
Civil war, genocide, lots of terrible
Like
things.
memoir, yeah.
But that's not happening here. It's a dangerous world, but we're insulated from it because we've got Big Brother America next door, and they're going to make sure that nobody messes with us. In many ways, it's like sort of having Gondor and Rohan, protecting us from the evil of Sauron.
Oh, certainly.
And
Yeah,
I just thought of that now, but it makes sense to me.
Yeah. Yes, certainly. Yeah, yes. And we can look at it that way. And yeah, I think so.
I don't know. Maybe it's maybe I'm reading too much into the fictional story, but but it's fun to do that. I think it's Neil. I think Neil Gaiman has the phrase that fiction is the lies that we use to tell the truth, and so that's I think that a good book like Lord of the Rings, fictional story, still there's a lot of truth and wisdom that is held within those pages.
Well, certainly. And again, I was going back to our opening discussion. It's like, why else would people be so attracted to it, right?
Yeah.
What is it that's in there? Well, it's the truth, right? It's a window into our reality, is what it is. So it's not an escape from the world. It's rather a mirror which we can look into and then better understand what's going on around us.
Yeah, maybe this would be like the last thing that I ask you before I let you go. And I know I told you a couple days ago that we'd keep this to an hour, and we've blown through that.
Okay. I haven't kept track, so.
Okay, so in 100 years from now, is Lord of the Rings going to be that iconic work of fiction that we know of it today, or is it going to be sort of antiquated and a piece of fiction that people have forgotten about?
I think it has legs. I think it does have the ability to stick around for long run. There's two reasons for this. One is that it's written text. So as a written text, it has the appeal to the imagination. Tolkien is big on the imaginary world, as opposed to in his day. I mean, cinema wasn't really around, but drama was, like theater, and he detested what he saw when he saw Macbeth being put on stage, because he wanted to imagine like I forget the name of the forest, but the forest actually approaching the castle where Macbeth is being laid siege to, and it turns out, well, it's just men carrying branches, right? And across the stage, I don't know how that looked. So
Yeah.
so that's kind of like the ants.
On stage.
What's that?
Kind of lame when you put that on stage.
Exactly. So utterly disappointing. But whereas in his imagination, when he can read this, it takes on whole other proportions, and then that's partly where the ants come in, right? But so part of he had this thing against the visual arts. Now, it's a very interesting discussion to get into, because now with CGI and so forth, are the computer graphics and so forth, you can have a really some pretty polished stuff on the screen. But the fact that it's written, I think it's much more going to engage the imagination, and therefore becomes less dated. All right. So I mean, you could still pick up Homer and read it, and because it's it's really a poem that's supposed to be sung, but you can still see what's going on.
Yeah.
Because that imagination is going. Where I'm thinking something like Star Wars, maybe it might have some enduring appeal, but the further time goes on, the older the graphics might seem, and so on. But then again, you do have some storylines that are there, like the father-son relationship, the lost father, which I think are enduring as well. So with Tolkien, yes, I'm gonna say I'd be very confident if I was buying shares, I'd buy them in Tolkien. That yeah, 100 years from now, people are still going to be reading this, and that the world is still going to be alive, that people can inhabit.
Cool, man. I think that's a pretty good place to end off. There, even now, there's all kinds of like questions and topics circulating in my mind, but it's getting late though, so we may have to save it for a part two.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough.
Thanks for
Well,
being
hey, thanks for inviting me on. It was a great conversation. So yeah, thanks, Russ.
You should really you should put some of your those session talks on post them somewhere like on YouTube or something.
Yeah, I got to get around to it one day. I've promised my parents. So the first was like, hey, you gotta see what, you gotta hear some of my talks. So I was like, okay, I got to get around to this. But yeah, that's something on the to-do list.
Okay, thanks a lot, man. Really appreciate it, and hopefully, I mean this. Hopefully, we can talk again sometime.
Oh, absolutely. Send me a line, and we'll do it.
Okay. All right. Thanks, man.
Okay, Russ. Take care.
Yeah. Cheers. Bye.
Goodbye.
And that concludes my discussion with Gerard McLarney. If you like today's episode, if you like what we're doing here, then do me a small favor. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow the podcast. Hey, you can leave a comment and tell me what you think about the topics we covered today, and I'll do my best to get back to you and respond, and we can sort of keep this conversation going. Speaking of which, big thanks to Ski Bum Plus, Steve Ingram, Bugsy Malone, Augusto Pinochet, and Chelsea Scott, to name just a few. Gentlemen, ladies, thank you for your support. Finally, I'm going to dedicate this show to everyone out there searching on a quest to find their own myth and battling the orcs and the dragons along the way in our own lives. That's it for today's show. Until next time, out.